You'll need this tonight, the man said, placing a small wooden box gently in front of me, as if it weighed more than it looked, as if it carried something that could change the course of a life without making a sound. I remember the exact way his voice settled into the space between me and my husband, low and certain, like he wasn't making a suggestion but delivering something inevitable. I looked up at him, confused, my hand still wrapped around my coffee cup, the warmth fading faster than it should have. He wasn't someone I recognized. Late 60s, maybe early 70s, dressed neatly but not expensively, the kind of man you'd pass in a grocery store and forget seconds later. But there was something in his eyes that didn't belong to a stranger. Something that lingered too long. Edward noticed him too, of course. My husband had always been observant when it came to anything that disrupted routine. He straightened slightly in his chair, his smile tightening in a way I had seen before but never fully understood. I think you've got the wrong table, Edward said, his tone polite but firm, the way he spoke to telemarketers or waiters who brought the wrong order. The man didn't respond to him, not even a glance. His attention stayed on me, as if Edward wasn't part of the picture at all. Tonight, he repeated softly, sliding the box an inch closer to my hand. Don't ignore it. And then he turned and walked away, just like that, blending into the quiet hum of the cafe as if he had never been there in the first place. For a moment neither of us spoke. The clinking of dishes, the low murmur of conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, all of it felt distant, like it belonged to another room. I stared at the box. It was simple. Dark wood, smooth edges, no markings, no lock. Something you might find at a craft fair or tucked away in an antique shop. Nothing about it suggested urgency. Nothing about it explained the weight that suddenly settled in my chest. Well, that was strange, I said finally, forcing a small laugh that didn't quite land. Edward picked up his coffee and took a sip, but his eyes flicked to the box again just for a second before looking away. Probably some kind of mix-up, he said. People are getting weirder these days. His voice was steady, casual. Too casual. I had been married to Edward Collins for 42 years. I knew the difference between his normal voice and the one he used when he wanted something to disappear without discussion. I looked at him more closely. He avoided my gaze, focusing instead on stirring his coffee long after the sugar had dissolved. The spoon tapped softly against the porcelain, over and over, like he needed the rhythm to keep something else from surfacing. Do you think we should call someone? I asked. Like the manager? For what? He replied quickly, a little too quickly. A guy leaving a box? There's nothing illegal about that. I nodded slowly, but something didn't sit right. Edward had never been dismissive about things that felt off. If anything, he used to be the one who insisted on caution, on double-checking, on making sure everything was as it should be. That was the man I remembered. The man sitting across from me now felt distant. Not just in that moment but lately. Especially since Daniel married Sophie. I rested my fingers lightly on the box but didn't open it. The wood was cool to the touch. You're not actually thinking of opening that here, are you? Edward asked, finally meeting my eyes, and there it was, that flicker. Not concern. Not curiosity. Something closer to unease. I withdrew my hand slightly. I was just looking, I said. We can throw it away when we leave. He relaxed almost immediately, leaning back in his chair, his shoulders lowering just enough for me to notice. Good idea, he said. No need to get involved in something that doesn't concern us. Something that doesn't concern us. The words echoed in my mind longer than they should have, because for some reason I couldn't shake the feeling that it did concern me, that it had been meant for me, specifically me. The rest of our coffee passed in a quiet that felt heavier than silence. Edward checked his phone more than usual. I watched the reflection of his screen in his glasses, catching quick flashes of messages he angled away from my view. When the bill came, he paid quickly, almost eagerly, as if he wanted to leave before something else could happen. But I didn't move right away. I looked at the box again. It hadn't changed. Still small. Still ordinary. And yet, everything about the afternoon now felt different because of it. Margaret, Edward said gently, standing up. Let's go. I nodded, finally pushing my chair back. But instead of leaving the box behind, I picked it up. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe it was the way that man had looked at me like he knew something I didn't. Edward paused when he saw it in my hands. Just for a second. But that second was enough. "You're taking it?" he asked. "Just in case," I said, slipping it into my purse. "I can always throw it away later." He didn't argue. He didn't smile either. We walked out of the cafe together side by side, just like we had done thousands of times before. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the space between us, in the silence that followed us to the car, in the way Edward started the engine without saying a word. I rested my hand on my purse, feeling the shape of the box inside solid and real. And for the first time in a long time, I had the quiet, unsettling sense that whatever was waiting inside it was already too late to ignore. I did not open the box that afternoon. I told myself I would wait until I got home, that whatever curiosity had taken hold of me could be managed with patience. That was always how I had lived my life. Quiet decisions. Careful timing. But as Edward drove us back, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead, I could feel the weight of it in my purse as if it were pressing against me from the inside. He did not turn on the radio. He did not ask me what I thought about what had happened. He did not make one of his usual remarks about traffic or the weather or the way people no longer knew how to drive properly. The silence was not peaceful. It was deliberate. And that made it louder than any noise. I watched him from the corner of my eye. The lines around his mouth seemed tighter than usual. He tapped his fingers once against the steering wheel, then stopped himself, gripping it instead. That was something new. Edward had never been a man who betrayed nervous habits. He believed in control, in composure, in keeping things contained, which was why the absence of that control felt more revealing than any confession. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. White siding, blue shutters, the small maple tree in the front yard just beginning to show the first hints of early fall. It should have felt like home. It should have grounded me. Instead, it felt like I was stepping into a place where something had already begun to shift without my permission. Edward got out of the car quickly, faster than usual, and headed toward the front door without waiting for me. I noticed that too. He had always opened the door for me even after all these years. It was one of those small habits that never needed to be spoken about. Today he forgot, or chose not to remember. I followed him inside, closing the door softly behind me. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No television humming in the background. No distant sound of the washing machine. Just stillness. Edward set his keys down on the entry table with a little more force than necessary. "I have some work to finish," he said, already moving toward his study. "I will be in there for a while." He did not look at me when he said it. "All right," I replied. My voice sounded calm. It always did. I waited until I heard the door to his study close before I moved. Slowly, I walked into the kitchen, placing my purse on the counter. My hand rested on it for a moment, feeling the shape of the box again through the leather. I could open it right then. Nothing was stopping me. No one was watching. But something held me back. Not fear. Not exactly. It was the sense that timing mattered. That whatever was inside that box was meant for a specific moment. The man had said tonight. Not now. Tonight. I exhaled slowly and stepped back, turning instead to the sink. I rinsed out the coffee cup I had brought home earlier that morning, even though it was already clean. I wiped down the counter. I adjusted a dish that did not need adjusting. Small, ordinary movements. The kind that keep your hands busy when your mind refuses to settle. From down the hall, I could hear faint sounds from Edward's study. The soft click of a keyboard. The low murmur of his voice. He was on a call. That too was unusual. He rarely took calls at home anymore. Especially not at this hour. I moved quietly down the hallway, not making a sound, and paused just before the door. I did not intend to listen. That is what I told myself. But then I heard my name. Just once. Soft. Careful. And that was enough to root me in place. "She does not know," Edward said, his voice lower than I had ever heard it. There was a pause as if he was listening. "No, everything is fine. We are still on schedule." Another pause. My heart beat once hard, then again slower. Measured. "Tonight," he added, almost whispering the word. "Tonight." The same word the stranger had used. I stood there, my hand resting lightly against the wall, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips. The house, the marriage, the life I thought I understood suddenly felt like something I was only just beginning to see clearly. I stepped away from the door before the floor beneath me could betray my presence. Back in the kitchen, I picked up my purse again. This time I did not hesitate as long. I opened it just enough to see the edge of the wooden box inside. Still there. Still waiting. I closed the purse again and carried it with me to the living room, setting it down beside me as I sat on the couch. The afternoon light stretched across the floor in long, quiet lines. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. I rested my hand on the purse again, my fingers lightly tracing the outline beneath the leather. Tonight, he had said. And now, for the first time, I understood that whatever was inside that box was not just something I needed. It was something I had been meant to find, before someone else made sure I never could. The house seemed to hold its breath as the afternoon slowly folded into evening, the light outside dimming inch by inch until the windows reflected more of the inside than the world beyond them, and I found myself watching my own reflection instead of the street, a woman sitting still with her hands resting on a purse she had not let out of her sight for hours, as if letting it go even for a moment might allow something to slip away that could never be recovered. And I realized then that I was no longer waiting out of curiosity but out of certainty, because something had already begun and I was simply catching up to it, not controlling it, not stopping it, just arriving at the moment I had been led toward without knowing it, and that thought settled quietly into me in a way that felt colder than fear. More precise, more final, like a truth that had been standing just behind me for years and had finally stepped into view. And when I heard the door to Edward's study open down the hall, I did not turn right away. I did not call out to him or ask what he had been doing or who he had been speaking to, because I already understood that whatever answers he might give would not be the ones that mattered, and instead I kept my eyes on the window until his footsteps entered the room behind me. Measured, controlled as always, but now carrying something else beneath them, something careful, something aware. "Margaret," he said, his voice smooth again, almost too smooth, as if the man I had overheard earlier had been someone else entirely. "I was thinking we should have dinner early tonight." And there it was again, that word, placed so casually into the conversation that it might have gone unnoticed if I had not already been listening for it, if I had not already begun to understand. That timing was no longer a coincidence but a pattern. "That sounds fine," I replied, finally turning to look at him, and for a brief second our eyes met, and I saw it again, that flicker, not guilt, not quite, but something closer to calculation, something that measured not what I knew but what I might know. And I held his gaze just long enough to let him see that I was paying attention, not reacting, not questioning, just present in a way I had not been before. And then I stood up slowly, taking my purse with me without thinking, without explanation, because by now it felt less like an object and more like an answer I had not yet opened. "I will set the table," I said, moving toward the kitchen, and he nodded, already turning away, already stepping back into whatever version of normal he believed he could maintain. And I watched him go for just a moment longer before continuing on, the rhythm of small familiar tasks guiding my hands while my mind moved somewhere else entirely, plates placed carefully, silverware aligned, glasses set with quiet precision, everything in its place the way it had always been, the way I had always made sure it was, because order had always been my way of holding things together, even when I did not fully understand what was coming apart. And yet tonight, for the first time, I was not arranging things to preserve what I had but to prepare for what I was about to see, and that realization did not frighten me, it steadied me, because it meant I was no longer the last to know. And when Edward returned to the kitchen, offering to help in a way that felt slightly rehearsed, slightly out of place, I let him. I allowed the quiet cooperation to continue as if nothing had shifted, as if the life we had built together still existed in the same form it always had. And when the food was set and we sat across from each other at the table, the space between us felt both familiar and entirely new, like a room I had lived in for years but was only now seeing clearly. And he spoke about ordinary things, about a call he had earlier, about Daniel possibly stopping by later in the week, about Sophie and some event she was planning, and I listened, nodding when appropriate, responding when needed. But all the while there was a second layer beneath the conversation, something unspoken that moved through every word, every pause, every glance, and I could feel it building toward something, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet certainty that does not need to announce itself to be real. And when dinner ended and the dishes were cleared, I did not rush, I did not change my pace or reveal anything that had already begun to take shape inside me. I simply carried my purse with me back into the living room and sat down once more. The evening now fully settled outside, the house wrapped in that same stillness as before but no longer empty of meaning, and I rested my hand on the purse again, feeling the box beneath the leather solid, waiting, and this time I did not look toward Edward. I did not seek his expression or measure his reactions, because whatever I needed to understand was no longer in him. It was here within reach, within my control, and for the first time since that man had placed it in front of me, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Not because I was ready, but because waiting any longer would mean choosing not to see, and that was something I could no longer afford to do. The moment did not arrive with noise or urgency, it came quietly, almost gently, as I reached into my purse and finally lifted the wooden box into my hands, feeling its weight more clearly now than I had before, as if it had been waiting for me to be ready rather than simply waiting to be opened, and for a brief second I just held it there, resting against my palms, tracing the smooth edges with my fingers, noticing how carefully it had been made. How deliberate every line seemed, like someone had taken their time knowing exactly what it would carry, and I realized then that whatever was inside this box had not been placed there by accident. It had been prepared, selected, delivered, and that thought did not make my hands tremble the way I might have expected. Instead it steadied them, because it meant this was not chaos, it was intention, and intention could be understood, and understanding meant control, and I opened the lid slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, just allowing the moment to unfold the way it was meant to, and inside, there was no single object, no simple answer, but a collection of things arranged with precision, a small stack of documents, a flash drive, and beneath them a folded photograph, and for a moment I did not touch anything, I simply looked, letting my eyes take in the shape of what had been hidden from me for so long, and then I reached for the photograph first, because something about it felt immediate, personal, and when I unfolded it, the room did not spin, my breath did not catch, there was no dramatic shift, just a quiet, undeniable recognition that settled into me like a truth I had already begun to accept. It was Edward and Sophie, standing closer than they should have been, not inappropriate in a way that would cause a scene, not something that could be easily explained away either, their posture, the angle of their bodies, the way Edward was looking at her, not like a father-in-law, not like family, but like something else entirely, something private, something chosen, and I stared at it for a long moment before setting it down carefully on the table beside me, not out of shock but out of clarity, because now I understood that whatever this was, it had not begun recently, it had been growing quietly, deliberately, just beyond the edge of what I had allowed myself to see. And I reached next for the documents, flipping through them one by one, pages of transactions, transfers, accounts I did not recognize but names I did, Edward's name, Sophie's name, appearing together in ways that did not belong in the life I thought we shared, numbers that added up to more than coincidence, more than error, something structured, something planned, and I felt something shift inside me, not breaking, not collapsing but aligning like pieces of a puzzle I had not known I was solving suddenly falling into place. And I thought back to the small things, the quiet changes, the moments I had dismissed because they did not seem important enough to question. The way Edward had started handling certain finances alone, the way Sophie had taken more interest in conversations that did not concern her, the way Daniel had become more distant without explanation. And now, all of it connected, not loosely, not vaguely, but with precision, with purpose, and I set the papers down beside the photograph, my movements calm, measured, as if I were organizing something rather than discovering it, and finally I picked up the flash drive, turning it over in my hand, its surface plain, unmarked, giving nothing away, and I stood up slowly, walking to the small desk in the corner of the living room where my laptop sat closed, waiting just as the box had waited, just as everything seemed to have been waiting for this exact moment, and I paused before opening it, not because I was afraid of what I would find but because I understood now that this was no longer about discovery alone. This was about what I would do with it, how I would carry it forward, and I glanced briefly down the hallway where Edward was, moving somewhere out of sight, unaware that the version of the evening he had been expecting had already begun to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, and I sat down, placing the flash drive beside the laptop, my hand resting on it for just a moment longer, feeling the quiet weight of everything it represented, and then I opened the laptop, the screen lighting up the room in a soft glow that felt almost too calm for what it was about to reveal, and as it came to life, I realized that whatever had been hidden from me until now was no longer out of reach. It was here, in front of me, ready to be seen, and for the first time since that man had spoken to me in the cafe, I understood that he had not been warning me about what might happen tonight. He had been preparing me for what had already been set in motion long before I ever noticed it. The laptop screen glowed softly in front of me, casting a pale light across the table as I inserted the flash drive with steady hands, the small click sounding louder than it should have in the quiet room. And for a moment nothing happened, just the faint hum of the machine and the distant sound of Edward moving somewhere down the hall, unaware, still following whatever version of the evening he believed was unfolding. And then the screen shifted, a folder appearing with a simple name, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention on its own, just a series of letters and numbers that meant nothing until I opened it. And when I did, the first file that appeared was a document labeled with a date from nearly 18 months ago. And I opened it without hesitation, my eyes moving calmly across the lines, not rushing, not searching for something specific, just allowing the information to reveal itself in the order it had been arranged. And what I saw was not confusion, not speculation, but structure, agreements, transfers, signatures, Edward's name appearing exactly where it should not have been, paired with Sophie's in a way that removed any remaining doubt, and I felt something settle deeper inside me, not shock, not even anger, but recognition, because this was not a single mistake, it was a system, something built carefully over time, something that required cooperation, planning, and above all intention. And I clicked into the next file, and then the next, each one adding another layer, another piece, until the shape of it was no longer something I had to interpret, it was something I could see clearly. Accounts opened without my knowledge, assets redirected, funds moved in patterns that would have looked ordinary to anyone not paying close attention. But now, with everything in front of me, the pattern was unmistakable, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, my eyes resting on the screen, not overwhelmed, not lost, just absorbing the reality of what had been done. And I thought about all the times Edward had reassured me that everything was taken care of, that I did not need to worry about the details, that he would handle it, and I had trusted him, not blindly but willingly, because trust had been the foundation of everything we built together. Or at least that was what I had believed. And now I could see that while I had been preserving that foundation, someone else had been quietly dismantling it piece by piece, not in a way that would cause it to collapse all at once, but in a way that would leave me standing on it long enough to believe it was still there. And then I opened the final file in the folder, and this time it was not a document, it was an audio recording. And I hesitated for just a second before pressing play, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this would not add new information, it would confirm what I already knew in a way that could not be explained away. And as the voices came through the speakers, clear, unmistakable, I did not need to adjust the volume or replay it to understand. Edward's voice, controlled but different from the one he used with me, more direct, more open, and Sophie's voice lighter, confident, speaking in a tone that carried no hesitation, no doubt, discussing timelines, discussing arrangements, discussing me not as a person but as a variable, something to be managed, something to be accounted for. And I listened without interruption, without reaction, letting every word settle into place, because this was not the moment for emotion, this was the moment for clarity. And when the recording ended, I did not immediately close the laptop, I did not rush to confront or question or even stand up. I simply sat there, my hands resting calmly in front of me, my mind moving through everything I had just seen and heard, organizing it, understanding it, not as something that had happened to me, but as something I now fully understood. And I realized then that the most dangerous part of what they had done was not the deception itself, it was the assumption that I would never see it, that I would continue living inside the version of reality they had created for me, that I would remain exactly where they had placed me, unaware, dependent, predictable. And that assumption was what had allowed all of this to exist for so long. And slowly I reached forward and closed the laptop, the soft click of it shutting echoing faintly in the room, and I looked down at the wooden box still resting beside me, now empty of mystery but full of meaning, and I understood something with absolute certainty. This was not the end of something, it was the beginning of something else entirely, because now that I knew, truly knew, the question was no longer what they had done, but what I was going to do next. And for the first time that evening, I allowed a small, almost imperceptible shift in my expression, not a smile, not quite, but something close to it, something that did not come from satisfaction or relief, but from the quiet realization that the one thing they had not accounted for, the one thing they had underestimated completely, was me. Once the screen went dark, the room seemed quieter than before, as if even the walls were holding back sound, waiting to see what I would do next, and I remained still for a few seconds longer, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that rushing would only serve them, not me, and I had no intention of moving at their pace anymore. So instead I took a slow breath and stood up, carrying the wooden box with me back into the kitchen, placing it carefully in a drawer as if it were nothing more than an ordinary object, something that belonged there, something that would not draw attention if someone happened to look. And then I closed the drawer gently, making sure the sound was no different than any other evening, no different than any other routine, because from this moment forward, everything I did needed to feel exactly the same on the surface, even if everything beneath it had already changed. And I turned on the sink, letting the water run for a few seconds longer than necessary, giving myself time to think not about what had happened, but about what would happen next, because understanding the truth was only the first step. What mattered now was how I would use it, how I would move through the next hours, the next days, without revealing that anything had shifted. And I dried my hands slowly, placing the towel back in its place with the same care I had always used, because consistency was not just habit, it was protection. And when I stepped back into the hallway, I could hear Edward moving again, the sound of a cabinet opening, the faint clink of a glass, small details that would have once meant nothing, but now felt like pieces of a larger pattern I was only beginning to see fully. And I walked into the living room just as he entered from the kitchen, holding a glass of water, his expression calm, composed, exactly as it had been earlier. And for a moment we stood there, facing each other, both of us carrying knowledge. The other did not fully understand, or at least that was what he believed. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes watching me just a little too closely, measuring, always measuring, and I nodded, offering the same calm he expected, the same version of myself he had grown used to over the years. "Yes," I said simply, and I meant it, not because everything was all right, but because I was no longer uncertain, and that made a difference, a quiet but important one. And he seemed to accept the answer, or perhaps he chose to, turning slightly as if to return to whatever he had been doing before. And that was when I spoke again, not loudly, not suddenly, just enough to shift the direction of the moment. "Without drawing attention to it, Edward," I said, and he paused, looking back at me. "Did you need anything else tonight?" The question was simple, ordinary, the kind of thing I had asked 100 times before, but this time it carried something else beneath it, something he could not quite identify, and I watched as he considered it for a fraction of a second longer than usual, as if he were deciding not just how to answer but how much to reveal. "No," he said finally, "I think everything is in place." And there it was again, that phrase, not unusual on its own, but now layered with meaning I could not ignore. And I gave a small nod, as if his answer satisfied me completely, as if I had no reason to question it. And he continued on, leaving the room without another word. And I remained where I was for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle again. But this time it felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but controlled, because now I understood that whatever they had planned for tonight, whatever they believed was already set in motion, was based on the assumption that I would follow the same path I always had, that I would remain unaware, predictable, and that assumption was still intact, at least in their minds, and that gave me something they did not have: time. And I turned toward the window again, the darkness outside now complete, the reflection staring back at me clearer than before, not smaller, not diminished, but sharper, more defined, as if the version of myself that had existed quietly in the background for so long had finally stepped forward, not to confront, not to accuse, but to observe, to wait, to choose the moment when everything would shift in a way that could not be undone. And I reached for my phone, not hurriedly, not secretly, just another ordinary action in an evening that appeared unchanged. And as I held it in my hand, I realized that for the first time since this began, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was deciding what would happen next, and that was something they had never planned for. I did not make the call right away, even though my hand rested on the phone and the number I needed was already in my mind, because I understood that timing was no longer something I could leave to chance. It was something I had to control with the same precision they had used against me. And so instead I placed the phone down on the table and sat back, letting the quiet stretch out around me, listening to the faint sounds of the house as if they might reveal something more. The soft movement from the hallway, the distant opening and closing of a door, the subtle rhythm of a life that continued as if nothing had changed. And I realized then how carefully everything had been maintained, how normal it all appeared on the surface, how easy it would have been for me to continue living inside it without ever seeing what had been built underneath. And that thought did not bring anger, it brought clarity, because it meant that whatever I did next could not be rushed, It had to be just as deliberate, just as quiet, and I stood up slowly, picking up my phone again, this time not hesitating, and I walked toward the back of the house, away from the hallway, away from Edward, stepping into the small laundry room where the door could be closed without drawing attention, and I shut it gently behind me, not locking it, not creating any sign of secrecy, just enough to ensure that my voice would not carry. And then I made the call, holding the phone to my ear as it rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered, calm, professional, unchanged by the years since I had last needed to hear it. "This is Martin Reynolds," he said, and I allowed myself a brief pause before responding, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this moment mattered. "Martin, this is Margaret Collins," I said, my voice steady, measured, exactly as it had always been, and there was a slight shift on the other end, recognition settling in, followed by something else, something more attentive. "Margaret," he replied, "it has been a while, how can I help you?" And I closed my eyes for just a second, not to gather strength but to align my thoughts, because I was not calling to ask questions, I was calling to move forward. "I need to review everything," I said, keeping my tone even. "All accounts, all property documents, anything that has been handled in the past 2 years. I want copies, complete records." And there was no immediate response, just a brief silence that told me he was already understanding more than I had said, already reading between the lines. "Is there a reason for this request?" he asked carefully, and I let the question settle before answering, choosing my words with the same care I had seen in those documents earlier. "I believe there have been changes made that I was not informed about," I said. Not accusing, not explaining, just stating what I now knew to be true, and I could hear the shift again, more definite this time, more focused. "I understand," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "I will gather everything and have it ready for you first thing in the morning." And I nodded, even though he could not see me. "Thank you," I replied, and then after a brief pause I added, "And Martin, I would appreciate discretion," and there was no hesitation in his answer. "Of course," he said. And I ended the call without another word, lowering the phone slowly, not rushing to move, not reacting to what I had just set in motion, because this was only the beginning, and I stepped back out into the hallway, the house exactly as I had left it, the quiet unchanged, the routine intact, and as I walked back toward the living room, I could hear Edward again, his movements steady, predictable, the same man he had been an hour ago, the same man he believed he still was in my eyes, and when I entered the room, he glanced up briefly, offering a small, familiar smile that I returned without effort, without hesitation, because nothing on the surface had shifted, not yet, and I sat down once more, my posture relaxed, my hands resting lightly in my lap, the same way they had earlier, the same way they always had, but now there was something else beneath that stillness, something quiet and controlled, something that did not need to be seen to exist. And as the evening continued, as the minutes passed without interruption, without confrontation, I understood that whatever they had planned for tonight was still moving forward, still unfolding exactly as they expected, and that was precisely what I needed, because the only way to see the full shape of what they had done was to let it continue just a little longer, just enough for everything to come into view. And I leaned back slightly, my gaze steady, my expression unchanged, knowing that by the time they realized anything had shifted, it would already be too late to return to the version of events they had been counting on. The evening moved forward with a kind of quiet precision that felt almost rehearsed, as if every moment had already been decided long before I became aware of it, and I allowed myself to move within it without resistance, without interruption, watching, listening, noticing the small details that once would have passed without meaning, the way Edward checked the time more often than usual, the way his phone remained face down on the table but never far from his reach, the way his attention seemed divided between the room and something else entirely, something just beyond it, and I did not question him, I did not ask what he was waiting for, because I already knew that whatever it was part of something larger, something that was meant to unfold tonight, and so I remained still, present, allowing the rhythm of the evening to continue as expected. And when the clock on the wall moved past 8, there was a subtle shift, not loud, not obvious, but enough for me to feel it, like a change in the air before a storm that never announces itself directly. And Edward stood up then, not abruptly, but with intention, setting his glass down carefully as if marking a transition. "I think I am going to step outside for a moment," he said, his tone even, practiced, and I nodded without hesitation, offering the same calm acceptance I had given him all evening. "Of course," I replied, and he hesitated for just a fraction of a second, as if expecting something else, a question. a reaction, anything that might confirm the version of me he believed was still in place, but when it did not come, he simply turned and walked toward the front door. And I listened as it opened and closed, the sound soft, controlled, leaving the house in a deeper silence than before. And I did not move immediately, I did not rush to the window or follow him because this was not about catching him, it was about understanding the full shape of what had been planned, and I sat there for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around me until I heard it, faint at first, then clearer, the low sound of a car pulling into the driveway, tires rolling slowly over the pavement, stopping just short of the garage, and I stood then, not quickly, not cautiously, just moving with the same steady pace I had maintained all evening, and I walked toward the window, not pressing close, not revealing my presence, just enough to see what I needed to see. And there she was, Sophie, stepping out of the car with the same composed confidence she carried into every room, her posture straight, her movements deliberate, as if she belonged exactly where she was, and Edward met her halfway up the walkway, not surprised, not questioning, just as expected, as if this meeting had been arranged down to the minute, and they did not linger outside. They did not speak in a way that suggested uncertainty, they simply moved together toward the door, and I stepped back from the window before they reached it, returning to my seat in the living room, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, and when the door opened and they entered, I looked up as if nothing about this moment was unusual, as if I had not already seen what I needed to see. "Sophie," I said, my voice warm, steady, exactly as it had always been, and she smiled, that familiar, carefully practiced smile that revealed nothing and everything at the same time. "Margaret," she replied, stepping inside as if she had every right to be there, and Edward followed just behind her, closing the door with the same quiet precision he had used all evening, and for a moment the three of us stood there, the space between us filled with something unspoken, something that had been building long before tonight but had finally taken shape in a way that could no longer be ignored, and yet no one acknowledged it, not directly, not yet, because they believed they still controlled the moment, they believed I was still where they had left me, unaware, unprepared, and I allowed that belief to remain intact because it was the only thing giving me the advantage I now held, and I gestured lightly toward the living room. "Come sit," I said, as if this were any other evening, any other visit, and they moved forward without hesitation, taking their places as if nothing had shifted, as if everything was exactly as it should be, and I watched them both, not with suspicion, not with anger, but with clarity, because now for the first time I was not trying to understand what was happening, I already knew. And all that remained was to see how far they were willing to go before they realized that I was no longer playing the role they had written for me. The room held a stillness that no one acknowledged, not openly, but it was there, settling into the space between us as Sophie took her seat across from me and Edward remained standing for just a second too long before finally sitting beside her. And I noticed the way their movements aligned, not perfectly, not obviously, but with a familiarity that did not belong to chance, and I folded my hands gently in my lap, watching them both with the same calm attention I had carried through the evening. Not searching for answers anymore, just allowing them to reveal themselves, and Sophie was the first to speak, her tone light, almost casual. "We did not mean to stop by so late," she said, though nothing about her presence suggested hesitation, and I nodded, offering a small, polite smile. "It is no trouble," I replied, and for a moment the conversation hovered there, waiting for something to begin, something that had clearly been planned but not yet spoken. And Edward cleared his throat softly, glancing toward Sophie before looking back at me, and I saw it again, that brief exchange, that silent coordination that confirmed what I already knew, and then he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together as if preparing to explain something reasonable, something that would make sense. "Margaret," he began, his voice steady, "there are a few things we need to discuss," and I inclined my head just slightly, giving him permission to continue without interrupting, without reacting, because this was the moment they had been building toward, the moment they believed would unfold according to their expectations, and Sophie shifted in her seat, her expression composed but focused, as if she were ready to step in at exactly the right time, and Edward continued, choosing his words carefully, "We have been reviewing some of our financial arrangements," he said, "and we believe it would be best to make a few adjustments moving forward," and I listened, not because I needed to understand what he was saying, but because I wanted to hear how he would say it, how far he would go before the truth revealed itself in his own words, and Sophie spoke then, smoothly, seamlessly. "It is just about simplifying things," she added, her tone reassuring. making sure everything is managed efficiently, especially as we look ahead. And I let a small pause settle between us before responding, not with a question, not with resistance, but with something simpler, something that would allow them to continue exactly as they intended. What kind of adjustments? I asked, my voice calm, neutral, and Edward exhaled slightly, as if relieved that the conversation was proceeding without complication, and he reached for a folder that had been placed on the table, something I had not noticed before but now understood had been brought in deliberately, and he opened it, sliding a set of papers toward me. These are updated documents, he said, just outlining the changes we discussed, and I looked down at them, not immediately touching them, just letting my eyes move across the surface, recognizing the format, the structure, the language that mirrored what I had already seen earlier that evening. And for a moment no one spoke, as if they were waiting for my reaction, waiting for confusion, for hesitation, for anything that would confirm their control over the situation. And I reached forward then, picking up the top page with steady hands, scanning it briefly, not because I needed to read it, but because I wanted them to see that I was following the process exactly as they expected. And I set it back down just as calmly, lifting my gaze to meet Edward's, then Sophie's, and I held that moment for just a second longer than necessary, long enough for something subtle to shift in the air, something they could feel but not yet understand, and then I spoke, my voice even, measured, unchanged. It is interesting, I said quietly, how much can be arranged without someone noticing. And there was a flicker then, brief but undeniable, passing between them, a hesitation that had not been there before, and Edward straightened slightly, his expression tightening just enough to reveal that something was no longer aligning with his expectations. What do you mean? He asked, and I did not answer immediately. I did not rush to explain or reveal, because this was not about confronting them, it was about shifting the ground beneath them in a way they could not anticipate, and I reached instead toward the table beside me, picking up the photograph I had placed there earlier, holding it lightly between my fingers before setting it down in front of them, not forcefully, not dramatically, just enough for them to see it clearly, and I watched as their expressions changed, not drastically, not in a way that would draw attention from anyone outside the room, but enough for me to know that the balance had already begun to shift, and I leaned back slightly, my hands returning to rest calmly in my lap, my posture relaxed, composed, exactly as it had been all evening, but now carrying something else beneath it, something they had not prepared for, and I met their eyes once more, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity, and in that moment, I understood that whatever they had planned for tonight had already unraveled, not because I had stopped it, but because I had seen it, and once something is truly seen, it can never return to the shadow where it once lived.